Women's suffrage. Prior to the 1920s, women had extremely limited roles in society, consisting mostly of staying in the home, cooking, cleaning, and taking care of the children. In the 1890s, many middle-class women joined the progressive movement as they had the time and means to do so. In having active roles in various other social reforms, women soon realized that they must be granted the right to vote in order to get their reforms passed, which began the fight for women's suffrage. In the span of around 20 years prior to the 1920s, the idea of progressivism was extremely popular. Progressivism was a support and advocacy of social reform, which also included women's suffrage. In this time period, spanning from the 1890s until the 1920s, there were many reforms passed, including citywide waste removal and the regulation of big businesses. It was also during this time that the National American Women's Suffrage Association was formed. As the progressive movement gained more momentum, middle-class women realized that in order to get their reforms passed, they needed to get the right to vote. One extremely prominent woman who fought for women's equality was Alice Paul, a Quaker who pushed for the adoption of an Equal Rights Amendment. Paul organized and marched in a suffrage parade on March 3, 1913, consisting of 20 parade floats and coinciding with the inauguration of elected President Woodrow Wilson. Alice Paul also facilitated pickets outside of the White House and blockades on sidewalks in order to get her message across to the public. She continued her fight in the months and years preceding before getting placed in solitary confinement. However, her fight proved fruitful as in 1920, President Woodrow Wilson announced his support for the women earning the right to vote. Under President Woodrow Wilson, the 19th Amendment was passed on August 18, 1920. This amendment stipulated, "The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex." This basically states that women had finally received the right to vote. The amendment was enacted right before the election of 1920. It is estimated that around 40% of women voted in the election. However, poor records were made concerning the attendance of the women. The National Women's Party was formed in 1916 in the midst of the fight for women's equality. It was a branch of the original Congressional Union for Women's Suffrage that was formed by Alice Paul just 3 years prior. Although women were granted the right to vote, they were still not treated as equals in society because they could not hold the same jobs as men, such as government positions. Therefore, in December of 1923, the Equal Rights Amendment was introduced to Congress by Charles Curtis and Daniel Anthony. Charles Curtis, senator, and Daniel Anthony, representative, were two men from Kansas who put forth the idea. However, it was never put into fruition. The amendment stipulated a proposed amendment to the U.S. Constitution stating that civil rights may not be denied on the basis of one's sex, an idea that was radical at this time. The fight for women's equality had continued. In September of 1924, the Women for Congress campaign was introduced in Pennsylvania by the National Women's Party, which fought and advocated for the presence of women in the government. During this campaign, 5 women ran for the election, but they did not win. The Women for Congress campaign continued and soon became a cross-country car tour in which women raised support and money for their cause. The National Women's Party continued campaigning throughout the 1920s, until finally, in October of 1929, they established a headquarters in Washington, D.C., named the Alva Belmont House. The National Women's Party became a driving force in the fight for feminism and gender equality that has continued throughout history. Now, I will show a short clip of a march that took place in which women marched from New Jersey to Washington, D.C.
The prohibition of alcohol in the 1920s was rooted in the temperance movement that occurred nearly a century earlier in America in the 1830s. Temperance, or the abstinence from consuming alcohol, became popular in the 19th century in rural areas in the South and the West. It was led mainly by Protestant women who looked to put a stop to physically abusive alcoholic husbands and fathers, as well as sexual assault. Groups including the National Women's Christian Temperance Union and the Anti-Saloon League were formed to put a stop to the horrors that were associated with alcoholism. Many women's groups and suffragists continued to fight for temperance and later prohibition up into the late 1920s. With the dawn of the 20th century and the beginning of the progressive movement, liquor soon became associated with all ills of society, including poverty, insanity, slums, and crime. Alcohol became a scapegoat for everything that was wrong in the United States. However, alcohol was not only an object of social concern, it also began to coincide with religion. The Protestant Church was beginning to become threatened by the influx of Catholic, Irish, and German immigrants. They associated the evils of drinking with these new Catholic immigrants as a way to tarnish their image in society and expand the platform of the Protestant Church. By the early 20th century, the idea of national temperance was rising in popularity. World War I was looming, and the United States officially entered the war in 1917. There were ads and posters circulating that associated liquor with Germany, saying that drinking could be treasonous. For the first time, the idea that drinking alcohol was un-American began to become a popular belief. However, there was still controversy surrounding national prohibition, as many members of the armed forces disagreed with the idea of national temperance. Despite the controversy, the 18th Amendment and the Volstead Act were passed by Congress in 1918. This made the manufacture, transportation, and sale of liquor and other alcoholic beverages illegal in the United States. However, the entire country was still not in agreement when it came to prohibition. Although rural America's morals coincided with national temperance, most people in urban cities were highly against prohibition. President Woodrow Wilson originally vetoed the Prohibition Act, but Congress overrode his veto with a 2/3 vote. The political leaders' disagreements perfectly portrays the division of American society in the 1920s when it came to prohibition. The purpose of national prohibition was to increase America's moral standards. Yet, it just so happened to have the complete opposite effect. Crime skyrocketed in the 1920s due to illegal bootlegging. This resulted in the rise of organized crime. Under the Volstead Act, buying and selling liquor was illegal. However, it was not completely illegal to own and drink liquor in your own home that had already been purchased prior to Prohibition. Private dwellings could not be searched without prior evidence of large amounts of alcohol being on the premise. The people found loopholes in this rule, and the 1920s was infamously known for its lavish and outrageous parties with illegal drinking. It was not just organized crime bosses that were gathering illegal liquor during the 1920s. Throughout the decade, normal, otherwise law-abiding citizens were learning to distill liquor in their own homes. Alcohol was distilled in bathtubs, coffee percolators, copper kettles, and other common household items. Prohibition had a number of effects on society in the 1920s. Not only did it promote a party culture, but it also affected the economy. Corn sugar sales skyrocketed because, when cooked with yeast and water, it was used to make a potent homemade alcohol. Grape sales also increased because people began to make their own wine at home. However, the economy as a whole was hurt after the loss of the alcohol industry. Large alcohol companies struggled to stay afloat. Some started selling near beer, the only type of beer legal at the time, because it had less than 0.5% of an alcohol content. The companies also started selling non-alcoholic beverages like soda. This led to the rise of candy stores and soda shops, which became a staple of American society for decades. Prohibition ultimately backfired immensely. It was repealed in 1933. Thousands of brewery employees, bartenders, waitresses, and saloon owners lost their jobs. The American economy was hurting from not being able to collect tax on alcohol anymore. After the Roaring '20s, the nation was on the verge of the Great Depression and overrun with crime and illegal activities. it was time for Prohibition to end. Organized crime began to make more of an appearance in the 1920s, specifically after the Volstead Act in 1919. Prior to the 1920s, loan sharking, drugs, burglary, robbery, gambling, prostitution, and contract violence were common in large cities such as New York City and Chicago. The Volstead Act, also known as the National Prohibition Act, was ratified in January of 1919. This act intended to carry out the intent of the 18th Amendment, which established prohibition in the United States. After this was put into place in the United States, the amount of crime in the United States raised by almost 24%. This included many different crimes such as burglaries, homicides, assaults and battery, and drug addiction. Burglaries increased by 9%, homicides increased by 12%, assaults and battery increased by 13%, and drug addiction increased by 44%. In the early 1920s, which was after the Volstead Act had been in place for a while, illegal production and trafficking of liquor began in major cities throughout the United States. The profits from this became so large that mobsters began to become more organized in their jobs. They employed lawyers, accountants, brewmasters, boat captains, truckers, and warehousemen. In addition, they hired criminals to be involved in the more dangerous jobs, which included terrorizing competitors. To speed up production, gangsters bought breweries and hired experienced brewers. They would also buy liquor from Great Britain and Canada, which created the term rum running. While these major illegal productions were being run, individuals were also getting paid to make gallons of liquor in their homes. The alcohol that was made legally was sold to mob-owned bars, which were always kept on high security. Because these productions began to cross ethnic lines, major mob groups were created, which formed many partnerships and rivalries. In fact, more than 1,000 people were killed in New York due to mob clashes with the Prohibition. Most of these major gangs were located in New York City and Chicago. The 5 families of New York, which included Gambino, Genovese, Lucchese, Bonanno, and Colombo, grew from the wealth produced by the Prohibition. Charles Lucky Luciano was the main instigator of modern American organized crime. Luciano began working for Arnold Rothstein, an illegal gambling boss, as an investigator in bootlegging. By the mid-1920s, Luciano was a multimillionaire and one of New York's top bootleggers. He made and imported alcohol with other Prohibition-rich associates. Luciano was also partnered with Frank Costello and Vito Genovese. Together, they worked for their Sicilian boss, Giuseppe Joe the Boss Mazzaria. Another major mobster during the 1920s was Joseph Valachi. Valachi was a member of the Minutemen gang in the 20s, which specialized in burglary. After many trips to prison, Valachi met Dominic the Gap Petrilli, who promised to get him into the mob. Valachi became a major name in the Prohibition. He continued to move up throughout the mafia, but eventually landed in prison.
War. Do you know how many people were killed altogether during that time on either side or both sides?
Senator, I got the score. The score was we lost 1, and they lost from 40 to 60.
Find him. What did you mean by that?
I get them. They can't find him means they can't find him to shoot him. So I said, I'll find him.
What does that mean in your terms? Does that mean that you were agreeing yourself to kill him?
Oh, yes, Senator.
When you were chosen for this job, did you have any choice? Is this something you had to do when you were asked to do it?
Well, you see, now, a thought like that never even enters on.
Did you decide to kill him at that time, at that spot?
Because he's the guy I spotted at that time. In other words, I felt that was my last day, in plain English, Senator. I felt that was my last day.
In other words, this was a defense for you. You thought that if you killed this man who you thought was going to kill you anyway, that this...
I got some satisfaction, Senator. Put it that way. First of all, I want revenge. That's right. As the Senator put it before, what did I get out of it?
What'd you get out?
Nothing but misery.
Let's demonstrate just what you did.
In other words, now, this piece of paper... This
What?
piece of paper is burnt.
Paper's burning.
You light it.
Yeah?
And then, in your hand, you say, well, again, they give you words in Italian, but I know what it meant.
In other words, while you were repeating the words, you were burning the paper.
Right. This is the way I burn if I expose this organization. Then he picks your finger.
Who?
The Godfather. Makes a little blood come out. In other words, that's to express the blood relation supposed to be like. He went on to explain that you live by the gun and by the knife, and you die by the gun and by the knife.
Who was chosen? Who became your godfather?
Joe Bonanno.
Joe Bonanno?
It happened to be
Now,
my
where
godfather.
is he? Is he on this chart we have here? Is he at the head of one of the families now?
Yeah, it still is.
He still is?
Yes.
Still alive?
Right. Everybody gets up and shake hands. They say a few more words together, which I can't recall. They also said in Sicilian.
But did you know what they meant?
Well, I never asked what it meant, but it meant like sort of in the style of an organization, or in that style. But you don't bother. I didn't bother. I never did bother.
You never did what?
I never bothered to find out what it meant, but I have an idea what it meant.
Well, you had an idea. What was your idea?
All tied up. Oh, we're all tied up.
We're
in
all
life.
together.
All together.
All together.
Right.
We sink together, hang together, live together.
Now, even if I talk, I should never talk about this, and I'm doing so. That's my best way to
That
explain.
is the highest oath you took.
Right.
In other words, that was the most sacred in this organization.
Right. I want
that
you.
you would never tell this.
Right. Senator, can I say something, Senator?
Yeah.
As to what I'm telling you now, I need to go no further to say nothing else. This is what I'm telling you, what I'm exposing to you and the press and everybody. This is my doom.
Joseph Villacchi was one of the first members of the Italian-American Mafia to publicly acknowledge its existence. He died in 1971. As previously mentioned, due to the creation of major gangs, violence became more of an issue in major cities. One of the most well-known events was the St. Valentine's Day Massacre in Chicago in 1929. This was because of a gang war between Al Capone and Bugs Moran. After the 1920s, prosecutions of the Mafia increased. Many of the large names of the organized crime world were questioned and sent to jail. However, this did not eliminate crime completely. Organized crime has developed severely since this time and can still be seen in major cities throughout the United States.
In addition to the previously mentioned topics, the 1920s was filled with various cultural alterations. From music, art, and literature to film, electricity, and the Harlem Renaissance, the 20s was a time for change. Jazz music exploded as a very popular form of entertainment in the 1920s, bringing African American culture into the white middle class. After the completion of World War I, many jazz musicians moved from New Orleans to northern cities like Chicago and New York. Since jazz was played everywhere, especially in speakeasies where alcohol was illegally sold during Prohibition, jazz rose in popularity very quickly. People such as Duke Ellington, Cab Calloway, and Chick Webb, and locations like the Apollo Theater and the Cotton Club all became associated with the Jazz Age itself. Jazz was expanded even more with the introduction of more radio broadcasting in 1922. One popular type of radio showing was called a Potter Palm. This was a concert jazz performance performed by amateurs over radio, broadcasted from New York and Chicago. Music was now able to be heard easily without visiting a club. Dances such as the Charleston were developed by African Americans but popularized by the white culture of America. White jazz artists received more radio time than black singers. However, Louis Armstrong, Jelly Roll Morton, and Joe King Oliver were all black jazz musicians that added an African American style when they had the chance to illustrate their talents.
Hot feet, sizzling soup, oh what will I do? Whack dilly bop bop bop. Hot feet, stinging like a busy bee. Hot feet, trot feet, smoke like a chimney. Hot heat, burning terribly, nearly makes a furnace out of me. Hot feet, and on what I mean, hot, 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 hot. White heat, that's the way they have got. Hot feet, Charleston's doing hot feet, shot feet.
Several female singers also came to be in the 1920s. These included Bessie Smith, Ella Fitzgerald, and Billie Holiday. Unfortunately, these women were not recognized fully until a few decades later. Although the jazz age is long over, elements of jazz still exist in American pop culture today. The Harlem Renaissance was a cultural movement in 1920s America that introduced many aspects of African American culture into the mainstream American culture. The movement was huge and even progressed into the 1930s. The Harlem Renaissance came to be as a section of the New Negro movement that started in 1917 as a reaction to race and class problems and discrimination. Harlem became home to the growing African American class. The Great Migration brought multiple thousands of blacks from the South to cities in the North. The beginning stage of the Harlem Renaissance was in the late 1910s.
No, 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 oh, no, I can't go for you.
During this time, theater became increasingly popular with playwright Ridgely Torrance, who used African American actors majorly. The plays denied black stereotypes that existed at the time. There was a large variety of literature produced during the Harlem Renaissance to apply to many audiences. Magazines and journals such as The Crisis, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, Opportunity, and the publication of the National Urban League all hired African American writers. In addition to recognized publications, authors also began publishing books and novels. Some of those individuals include Zora Neale Hurston, Arna Bontemps, Nella Larson, Wallace Thurman, Countee Cullen, Jessie Fawcett, Claude McKay, James Weldon Johnson, Jean Toomer, Aidan Locke, and Eric D. Waldron. African American writers in general wrote anything from poetry to fiction, dramas, and essays. Langston Hughes was a notable poet at the time who came to be known as the Poet Laureate of Harlem. The new generation of writers displayed themes of youth, ambition, and independence. F. Scott Fitzgerald's This Side of Paradise became popular among flappers, and The Great Gatsby was criticized at the time for showing an achievement-oriented society, but soon became extremely popular as well. Ernest Hemingway was also popular with The Sun Also Rises and A Farewell to Arms. A new way to play piano was developed in the Harlem Renaissance. It was called the Harlem Stride style. It added an element of wealth to the traditional jazz bands, with wide-set chords being played. The musical styles of African Americans was becoming increasingly attractive to the whites in the country. Blacks were merging with white artists in the musical world in an interesting way that illustrated the unity of music. The Harlem Renaissance truly set the foundation for the civil rights movement after World War II. It was more than an artistic movement. It was really a sociological change that showed the possibility for racial integration. The 1920s was a time of creativity that introduced new and brought back old styles of art. Art Deco was a design and architectural style that originated in Europe and then spread throughout North America. Visually, Art Deco is a style that incorporates colorful, extravagant ornamentation, curvy lines, and geometric shapes. Art Deco buildings can be found in Chicago, Los Angeles, San Francisco, and New York City. Expressionism and Surrealism were movements that originated in Europe that embraced surprise and nonconformity in art. Also, the Dada movement involved visual art, poetry, theater, and graphic design in relation to the time period with randomness and rejection of previous art standards. Prior to and at the beginning of the 1920s, all films were silent and colorless. Within Our Gates was a film produced in 1920 prior to the era of color and sound in films. However, by the late 1920s, films were the complete opposite. The Golden Age of Hollywood named the time period of cinema where major technological advances allowed for the advancements in the movie-making business. The first all-color film was called The Toll of the Sea. It was released in 1922, and soon after, in 1926, Warner Brothers Pictures released Don Juan, which was the first film with sound effects and music. Here is a clip from The Toll of the Sea. A year later, in 1927, Warner Brothers produced The Jazz Singer, the first film with any talking sequences. These milestones launched the Golden Age of Hollywood into full effect. The term talkies began to be used to describe movies and films with talking in them.
Wonderful pals are always hard to find.
The 1928 Warner Brothers film Lights of New York was the first all-talking feature. To end the decade, Warner Bros. Also unveiled the first all-color, all-talking film called On with the Show. Large studios like Warner Brothers began developing movie theater chains so their films could be viewed. Cartoons also quickly raised in popularity during this time. The later 1920s saw the rise of Walt Disney and his studio. Mickey Mouse and his Steamboat Willie in 1928 became known throughout the country. Other genres that became popular were westerns, slapstick comedies, musicals, animated cartoons, and biographical movies. Some of the most popular names of the decade in relation to movies were Theda Bara, Charlie Chaplin, Rudolph Valentino, Joan Crawford, Clara Bow, Mary Pickford, Douglas Fairbanks, Gloria Swanson, Greta Garbo, John Gilbert, and Colleen Moore. This was the first time that these stars were all contracted to work for a specific studio. Here is a clip of Charlie Chaplin titled The Lion's Cage. The production of domestic electric appliances in the 1920s skyrocketed with the help of increased electricity availability. Washing machines, vacuum cleaners, fans, irons, and dishwashers all were more available than ever before. These devices allowed household tasks to be done more efficiently. People, mostly women, did not have to spend as much time doing these household chores. On the entertainment aspect, radios broadcasted all types of programs that appealed to a variety of people. Most individuals had time now for this type of entertainment because the household appliances were doing a majority of the work for them. They flocked to movie theaters to watch all their favorite actors on the big screen. Through the construction of a car assembly line, which was pioneered by Henry Ford in 1913, there was a mass production of automobiles by the 1920s. Factories depended on electricity to run their machines and assembly lines. This caused the prices of cars to drop significantly, so more people bought cars, affecting both the petroleum and infrastructure industries. Electricity as a whole had a huge impact on the economy and culture of the 1920s.